Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to this episode of the Maritime Matters podcast. My name's Richard Dunley, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jennifer Parker. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we unpack the key developments that have been happening in maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond over the past few weeks. We're recording today on Monday, the 22nd of December, so just before Christmas. Hopefully we're going to get out this last episode just before Christmas, and then I think we might have a little bit of a break, Jen.
Yes.
But as ever, there has been so much happening recently, particularly on some of these stories, that it will almost certainly be out of date to a degree by the time we actually get this out. So our apologies on that front, as always. So how are things, Jen?
Good. You're right about every time we launch a podcast, honestly, within 12 hours, there's a major announcement. So I think last time we launched the podcast within 12 hours was the Hanwha-Austal announcement. So good. Lots happening, as you mentioned, in maritime. I've been pulling out a lot of my UNCLOS understanding for some discussions on BBC and some others about UN conventional law at sea, when you can conduct boarding operations and things like that. I think we'll probably get into that. Some interesting stuff too being pointed out on our YouTube channel. Thank you. We don't pay as much attention to the comments as we should, but we do check them every now and then. So thank you for some of the recommendations on there. We will get to, somebody mentioned quite a significant interview really that Admiral Hughes from the Royal Australian Navy, Head of Naval Capability, did with Naval News about the upgraded Mogami that Australia will be getting in 2029. So we will touch on that. It was a no changes, but changes. So we'll talk on that a little bit later. But yeah, looking forward to getting into this episode. So much happening.
Absolutely. So shall we dive in? And we're going to talk about, I think, first up, about some things that have been happening, I guess, outside of the region. And so the one of the kind of the developments that's been happening in terms of the conflict in Ukraine. And you've seen a number of different elements to this in the past week or so. One of which has been the growing expansion of Ukrainian attacks on the Russian Shadow Fleet. So the Shadow Fleet are these network of tankers and vessels which are used to basically get Russian oil out, despite the Western sanctions on oil and other hydrocarbons, get it out and get it to customers primarily in places like India and China. And this is a main way in which the Russian economy is still running, and they're financing the war in Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians have been seeking to target this. They've done this with a number of drone strikes against, uncrewed surface vessel strikes against ships operating in the Black Sea, so coming in and out of the Black Sea. But they've also, in the past day or so, expanded this, and there have been reports of an attack by aerial drones on a tanker that was operating in the Mediterranean. Now, this is quite a significant kind of geographical expansion, and it does raise certain questions and considerations. I think that many people would naturally feel that the Ukrainians have a right to target these vessels as a mechanism through which Russia is effectively financing the war. But the connections and the ties back to Russia are often relatively obscure. And there's also kind of questions around what happens to these vessels afterwards. So one of them that was attacked in the Black Sea was damaged and lost power, and then was drifting and was drifting in Turkish waters, and then was supposedly at least towed by the Turks in and dumped into Bulgarian waters because nobody wants to have to deal with the consequences of these attacks. So I think there's some real kind of difficult sort of questions that arise out of this, and quite how we deal with the question of shadow tankers, which I think we'll come on to talk more about in a second. What were your thoughts on these Ukrainian attacks?
Yeah, look, I'm trying to think of a word that's not interesting. I should read that list on our YouTube. Look, it's consistent with your kind of view. Like, it's certainly extending where the battle space is. Of course, there are questions that come up about what are belligerents, what are targets under the law of naval warfare, and it becomes a really murky area now when we think about the idea of shadow fleets and flags of convenience. And I think that this is probably symptomatic in many ways of something that many countries are trying to grapple with at the moment. And we'll talk about the US and Venezuela. I know Sweden has just done a boarding operation this morning, it looks like, of another shadow fleet tanker within its territorial waters. So there is this real question of how do you deal with this idea of the shadow fleet, and I think one of the challenges in itself is there's actually not a clear definition. So the IMO did push out a definition in 2023 about what a shadow fleet is. It's not a great definition. Often use the term shadow fleet interchangeably with dark fleet, which is actually not the same thing necessarily. A dark fleet or dark shipping is really shipping that doesn't operate using its internationally mandated AIS, which is often associated now with the shadow fleet and oil tankers, but also dark shipping is a huge thing when it comes to illegal fishing and narcotic smuggling, etc. And then now there's this new term that I saw Windward had put forward, which is this idea of the grey fleet. So I'm not sure I'm fully across the idea, but effectively one of the hallmarks, I guess, of the shadow fleet is this idea that they're either not flagged or they move their flags around different flags of convenience fairly regularly. They tend to be quite old tankers. They tend to operate outside of standard IMO regulations, whether it's operation of AIS, whether it is insurance or classification, etc. The grey fleet, I think, and somebody can correct us, I should have read this more, is this concept where they are kind of legitimately flagged and insured, but they're still doing different dodgy things, but inside the law, which is the difference. So I think a lot of it is the ambiguity in terms of
quite a lot of the.
Well, I guess we'll get into this a little bit later, I think, in the Venezuela discussion. But I think there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of what are the terms, but it certainly is a phenomenon that countries are now trying to grapple with, right? So we see Ukraine seeing these vessels as legitimate targets, but of course, under the law of naval warfare, there is a lot of rules around what merchant vessels you can target and how you can target them. And I think there would be some questions about some of this this targeting potentially. So yeah, look, it's a real murky area that I think increasingly we're going to have to grapple with now. And it'd be interesting to see, we might get into this later and I'm probably going on a bit, but whether we start to see a bit of a snapback now from registration with flags of convenience and this sort of thing. And I always thought that once vessels started being targeted, and there's not a lot of protection by flag of convenience states, and often they agree to boardings and things like that, that you might start to see countries moving back to a genuine linkage between flags and nationalities. Anyway, that was a long tangent from Ukraine, but I think this is kind of going to be the topic a little bit of this conversation. So Ukraine also interesting targeting as well of a submarine.
I'll just briefly mention that we've been hearing about the run to the flag for quite a while now, and I haven't actually seen any specific signs of this happening. So I think the economics of shipping is such that the benefits of maintaining a flag of convenience are so high that we're going to have to see quite a lot more risk before I think we see a significant run to the flag. Anyway, that was another tangent.
Valid point.
Ukraine, another interesting development there was, again, interesting. The attack by an underwater drone on a Russian improved Kilo class submarine. So this was a submarine which was in Russian naval base. The attack supposedly happened, and I think we're not entirely sure about this, on the 15th of December, so about a week or so ago now. The Ukrainians released some video footage showing the port and the submarine alongside, and then a large explosion. And it's been reported that this is an uncrewed underwater vehicle called a subsea baby, which is, I guess, a development on some of the previous Ukrainian USVs and UUVs that we've seen. Now, we should add, I guess, that the Russians have denied that any vessel was damaged, but from satellite imagery, etc., it seems pretty clear that a submarine was significantly damaged. Now, Ukraine, and I guess in some of the commentary around this, quite a lot has been made of this and the idea that this is a radical new departure, etc. I think both of us probably are a little bit more skeptical on quite how novel some of this is, and at what point does a one-way UUV become a torpedo, and all sorts of other elements around this. But I think what is unquestionably true, and what I think is particularly relevant more broadly, is the idea of the increasing vulnerability of vessels in harbour, or I guess maybe a return to the vulnerability of vessels in harbour, and the reality that we are going to need to see a lot more attention paid to port defences, and a return to some of the basic things like boom defences and nets and a whole range of other ways in which you look to provide security to vessels in harbour. Thoughts?
Yeah, look, I agree with you in terms of, thinking about port defence is going to be critical, and it's something that we largely ignored. I think I made the point in a paper I released about an Australian Coast Guard about 12 months ago that it's not entirely clear who's responsible for port defence in Australia. And one of the things I like, to kind of further the conversation, is the idea of bringing back, naval reserves, for example, who may be responsible for a local port or that sort of thing. But look, it does bring the attention back to port defence. I think, again, after we saw this attack, we saw lots of significant claims that naval warfare has fundamentally changed. It hasn't. Of course, naval warfare is always evolving, but again, a lot of reporting wanting to take this as somehow, submarines are vulnerable. Submarines are always vulnerable in ports. That's just a fact. So I think the lesson here is very much, as you wrote, about relearning port defence. I think it's a really important lesson for Australia. I mean, again, to my point, I'm not sure it's clear in Australia who is responsible for port defence. And some people will say, well, it is, depending on which port you're talking about, it is the police. And then there's a question about, okay, but state police clearly don't have the ability to protect ports in this way. And so certainly it was a naval function during World War II, and it's a conversation that we need to have. Again, though, I think, certainly significant kudos to Ukraine in terms of the way they have evolved USV and UUV operations. I mean, the types of USVs and UUVs that they're operating at scale and the ranges they're operating are significant, but I don't think it's a revolution in naval warfare.
No, and I guess just building briefly on the point you were making about Australian ports, most of the significant Australian naval ports also use a kind of commercial or commercial vessels also use the same approaches, and so there's another element of complexity here around in terms of defences that you'd need to involve. This couldn't just be a military role, and it's certainly not something that the police could do. This is something that would require a far more comprehensive kind of approach, and I think it's something that probably needs to have some significant attention paid to it, if it isn't already behind the scenes. But I think certainly attention has been refocused on this issue by what's been happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, no, I agree. Also not in the Indo-Pacific, but I think a kind of a really important discussion point. US Venezuela. What's going on there?
Absolutely.
What is going on there?
I think. Well, I think we can get into this one, but why don't you set the scenes? You've been discussing this at length on just about every media platform that will have you.
I have. So happy to get into it. Look, I think broadly, of course, we know since August this year there's been a large military build-up in the Caribbean, which has included the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, biggest aircraft carrier in the world, a number of surface combatants, a number of bomber flybys and things like that. And there's clearly a pressure campaign on Venezuela. From a maritime perspective, which is kind of really what we're focused here on, probably less on the geopolitics, there's kind of been two elements of this. One we've mentioned, but we haven't really touched upon. We probably won't get into too much today. But is the US targeting of over 20, I think it might be 29 now, but I'm not sure on the exact count, of alleged drug smuggling vessels. And these vessels tend to be, so think of them as large kind of power boats, generally with kind of 6 to 8 outboards on them, can go quite fast. And this is one of the key ways that drugs are smuggled through the maritime domain. So the US has traditionally intercepted these drug smuggling vessels. In fact, UK as well. I've previously been involved in operations in the Caribbean, intercepting these drug smuggling vessels. Normally, the drugs are seized, the prisoners are seized, and depending on who they are, where they're from, they're either prosecuted in the US or they're returned to their home country. In around August, September, the US took a different approach to this, which is targeting these vessels and effectively blowing them out of the water and killing all people on board. Over 80 civilians, it looks like. Now, the US argument is that they are in a non-international armed conflict with these drug smugglers who they have deemed is terrorists. And look, there is a whole legal discussion that can be had about this. Let's just say that it is a very tenuous argument. Even if you can make that tenuous argument, there is then a question about, when it comes to targeting necessity and proportionality. And certainly the idea of lobbing a missile into one of these go-fasts, most people would argue doesn't meet the requirements of necessity and proportionality. The second element, though, of the maritime campaign is what we've seen evolve over the last 2 weeks. Firstly, we saw the boarding of the motor tanker, or the oil tanker, Skipper, which initially was reporting that it was Guyanan flagged. Guyana came out and said it is not flagged to us. The boarding occurred in international waters. Where exactly is not entirely clear. That was about 10 days ago, 12 days ago now. Last Tuesday, we saw a statement from President Trump on social media stating that the US intended to enact a naval blockade on all vessels smuggling oil out of Venezuela. Now, there are some challenges with that in terms of the definition of a naval blockade that we'll get into, but safe to say, before we get into it, it doesn't meet the legal requirements of a naval blockade, and naval blockade is an act of war. Then, over the weekend, the US have undertaken a boarding of what appears to be a potentially legitimately flagged Panamanian vessel, the motor vessel Centuries, which again was departing Venezuela with oil on board. The difference between the Skipper and the Centuries is that the Skipper is on a list of US sanctioned vessels. The Centuries is not. Now, from a domestic US law perspective, that matters. From an international law perspective, that actually doesn't really matter. Then what looks like is occurring right now, I haven't checked the news recently, it may well have occurred by the time we get off and publish this podcast, is a third tanker This one heading to Venezuela, not heading out of Venezuela. It looks like it was carrying ballast, not oil. Often tankers from Iran do carry oil to Venezuela as well to mix it to increase the quality of the oil. But this tanker, the Bella, it looks like has made a run for it, and the reporting is now that the US is chasing this tanker. Now, chasing has gotten a lot of interest on the internet as funny. What I suspect is happening is it looks like with the first two boardings that they were what was called compliant boardings. So that the vessel was asked to stop and the master agreed to the boarding. Now, most boardings that are done are compliant boardings. It looks like if the vessel has made a run for it, the master has not agreed to stop, which makes it a non-compliant boarding. And in most navies, I can't speak specifically for the US Coast Guard, but in most navies, once something goes from a compliant to a non-compliant boarding, then you require a different set of authorizations. The decision to board sits at a higher level, and there is a conversation around a risk assessment of that boarding that is more significant than a compliant boarding, and we can get into that. So that's kind of where we are in the US Venezuela. And as we mentioned, this is not specifically the Indo-Pacific, but I think it is a really important conversation that leads on from a conversation around shadow tankers, etc. So there is my introduction to it. What is your take, Richard?
So I must say I have some significant reservations over what's going on. I think the first point is that the operation on the Skipper was initially, as you say, reported as being flagged to Guyana, but after the operation, the Guyanese government came out and said that was not the case. Now that makes the vessel stateless, and therefore, under international law, that means that the Americans have the right to board the vessel. Now, we're then seeing, obviously, what happened with the Centuries, which was Panamanian flagged. It has now been at least half reported. There have been indications from the US government that the Panamanians allowed the boarding. Now that has not been confirmed. So we still don't know that. If they did not allow the boarding, if there wasn't what's known as sort of flag state permission, then that is a very significant kind of escalation. Even without that, I think that we're on some quite dangerous kind of territory here, in which what we are seeing is something that is not uncommon, but it is where larger or more influential states seek to extend the jurisdiction of their domestic law onto the high seas. And this is something that Britain tried to do for large parts of the 19th century, largely in a wartime environment, and other countries, sort of more influential countries, have also pushed this. Generally speaking, there's been very strong pushback from others who rely upon using the seas because of the way in which this is potentially detrimental, and it undermines some of the key elements of how the seas are viewed in a legal environment and in a normative environment. This idea that the seas are a free space for everybody, and that there is a set of broad rules, but that is to a degree being undermined by this idea that the Americans can use domestic legislation. So the attack on the seizure of the MV Centuries, the administration statements have come out and said this is because the cargo was sanctioned, and was sanctioned under US domestic law. Now, we can, of course, make questions, and I think if we come back, we probably will talk more about this idea of the shadow tankers, and there being a whole challenge around regulation of these. What do they mean? How do we try to control or shape this? And that, I think, is a very valid argument, and as we said, it's already playing out in the Ukraine and elsewhere. But the idea that the Americans are seeking to extend domestic law into international waters in this kind of way, I think is a concern. Not least because if they can do it, anyone else can do it. And the likelihood that we will see other influential states seeking to use domestic law in the maritime environment, I think, is greatly increased by these kind of actions. And that's to the detriment of any nation that relies heavily upon the sea, including Australia.
Yeah, look, I think it's certainly an important conversation. I mean, when we do see, and we have actually historically seen countries trying to apply their domestic law, I guess I see it differently. My kind of first threshold question is it permissible under UNCLOS? And I guess when I think about boarding operations under the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, really all boarding operations generally are conducted for domestic reasons, right? But what you're trying to find in UNCLOS is there a jurisdictional nexus? Now, UNCLOS, and for those of you that are like UNCLOS experts, this is going to be boring. I might be accused of I'm not a man, but I guess mansplaining UNCLOS. But give me a moment to kind of do it for those that aren't so familiar with UN Convention on Law of the Sea. Effectively, the UN Convention on Law of the Sea is based on flag state jurisdiction. So the idea that where the vessel is registered has primacy over that vessel. And there's been lots of debates about whether that is now helpful with the idea of flags of convenience, which is not a new idea in many ways, but kind of was a new idea when the latest version of UNCLOS was being discussed and agreed. So boarding operations on a vessel will generally need the approval of the flag state. There are exceptions to that. Exceptions to that are things that have universal jurisdiction, so things like piracy, for example. So any government vessel can board a vessel that's committing piratical acts on the high seas. Things like vessels engaged in the slave trade. Still, vessels engaged in unauthorized broadcasting is also an exception to that law, which is interesting. A slight tangent, but an interesting tangent. I saw someone making an academic argument this week that spoofing of AIS, so faking your position on AIS, could be classified as unauthorized broadcasting under UNCLOS, which I think is an interesting argument. It's not. There's no precedent there. There's no state practice around this. But it is an interesting argument that I think should be pursued and developed further. Another exception is, as Richard mentioned, if the vessel is stateless. So my kind of view is, was there a jurisdictional nexus for that boarding operation to occur? And bearing in mind too that this has made the news a lot because of its linkage to the US pressure campaign, because of statements about naval blockades and land strikes and strikes on narcotics vessels and all of that sort of stuff. But boardings of vessels that are stateless actually happen a lot, specifically in counter-narcotics operations. So certainly if you're thinking about the vessels that smuggle narcotics, smaller vessels, but the vessels that smuggle narcotics across the Caribbean are generally stateless, or dhows that smuggle narcotics across the Middle East tend to be stateless as well. Boardings also occur when flag states agree to them. Now, flags of convenience, and one of the things with flags of convenience is they don't tend to care too much about the vessel that is flagged to them. So one of the benefits for flagging as a flag of convenience is that you don't necessarily pay much taxes and you don't necessarily get called over the coals if you don't comply with IMO regulations or ILO regulations, etc. So International Maritime Organization, International Labour Organization. One of the downsides of being flagged to a flag of convenience is if a country comes to a flag of convenience and says, I want to board this vessel because I don't like what it's doing, then often flags of convenience will generally say yes. When it comes to the Panama boarding, the Panama vessel, so look, there are a lot of vessels that do smuggle drugs, etc., across the Caribbean that are registered to Panama. And so Panama does have a history of saying yes to the US. And there are actually some agreements in place for certain circumstances, certain times you need to respond in terms of saying yes to boardings. So my kind of general view is on the first vessel, the MV Skipper. It is a stateless vessel, and so therefore, as you said, the US has the right to board there, and I think it's a good deterrent, to be honest, of some of these shadow vessels. And bearing in mind, the MV Skipper does have a dodgy history, to say the least, in terms of faking its position, ship-to-ship transfers, etc. The Sentries looks to certainly be, can't be certain, looks to be Panama flagged. Panama hasn't come out and stated that and confirmed it. There is reporting that Panama did agree to this, certainly in the Washington Post. And it is, I would say, likely that they did, I would say, based on my experience of boardings of vessels of flags and convenience and Panama in the Caribbean. The Bella, look, I think we need to know the facts of this one. There's some reporting it's stateless, there's some reporting it's flagged to Guyana. But I guess kind of my overall point is I tend to take a more permissive view as opposed to restrictive view of UNCLOS. I think in many ways, UNCLOS sought to restrict things a little bit too much. So my view is if there is a jurisdictional nexus, then under international law, it is okay to conduct that boarding operation. Now, you may well cast aspersions over the wider pressure campaign and all of those statements, and look, I certainly do. But I guess I'm supportive, and I guess a kind of second point is that I do think that there is a significant value in deterring these shadow fleet operations. Now, how do you do that? One, you encourage flags and convenience to deregister these vessels, which has actually happened. So Liberia, for example, has deregistered a bunch of flags and convenience. There is some work doing with some of the smaller countries like Pacific Island countries, making sure that they are aware of what these vessels are doing, encouraging them to deregister. Another way we're dealing with it is, of course, getting port states to take action against these vessels, and you can apply your domestic legislation. So if a vessel comes in to your port and it's unseaworthy, it's unsafe, it doesn't have insurance, etc., then you can actually seize that vessel if you've got the appropriate domestic legislation in place. And then the other one is boarding operations on the high seas, which are more high risk and not good value generally for navies unless they're linked to something like this. So look, that's my kind of overall comment as it stands. I don't have a huge problem with this aspect. I do have a huge problem with the targeting of the narcotic smuggling vessels.
Yeah, I guess just very quickly to come back, I think the need for a response to the shadow tankers, shadow fleet, dark fleet, however we want to, grey fleet, whatever we want to refer to it as, is clearly there. I think that this, however, sets a dangerous precedent, and the idea, I would suggest that there is a difference between requesting a flag state permission for something that is a counter-narcotics operation, and something in this instance which is clearly there's a wider political campaign behind it. And I don't think it is too much of a long bow to suggest that this approach of having a very powerful state seeking to pressurize states that are flag of convenience, or requesting states that are flag of convenience states to permit or allow boardings of vessels, is something that could be extended in other circumstances and in ways that could be deeply detrimental to the kind of the wider trading system. And I think it's also kind of important to point out why are there all of these shadow fleet vessels operating around here? It is because of American domestic legislation and sanctions on vessels operating with Venezuela. So that element of it, yes, there are real issues with these shadow fleets and how do we respond to them, but in many ways they are a product of precisely these approaches.
Well, it's not just US sanctions. So Australia also has sanctions on some vessels. So these vessels that have been boarded, not necessarily all of them. I'm not across the Bella at this stage that's in the process of being boarded, potentially, or chased, or whatever it's happening. There is, I mean,
love the idea of it being chased.
Yeah, just going 12 knots, big VLCC. Look, I think I'm losing my train of thought. I had a great point too. Yeah, look, there is certainly, it'll be interesting for those of you that don't follow tankertrackers.com. They're a worthwhile follow if you're interested in the Shadow Fleet. They've done a lot of great work on the Shadow Fleet. There is a lot of connection between these vessels, not only Venezuela, Iran, Russia, North Korea. I mean, there is a view that 20% of the tanker fleet in the world does this sort of stuff, but there are a lot of connections. So they are involved in not just moving Venezuelan oil. And the US is not the only. So Australia actually has a sanctions list of sanctioned vessels. We don't do boarding operations like this generally, but a lot of countries have lists of vessels that are sanctioned because of all sorts of different practices. But I do take your point on the Venezuela sanctions. The other thing I do say is a lot of these boardings. So I've mentioned the counter narcotics example, but there are actually a lot of other examples in terms of weapons smuggling, in terms of WND. There's a lot of this is more broader, and these boarding operations are more broader and more common for all sorts of reasons. This one comes to the fore, I think, because of the geopolitics, and you can't take the geopolitics out of it. One thing we didn't talk on, and we are going a long time, but we didn't talk on naval blockades. I guess the point about why is this not a naval blockade? So the tweet, or sorry, you can't say tweet. What is it? Truth Social said that it's they're going to conduct a naval blockade of all tankers taking oil out of Venezuela. So I guess briefly under the law of naval warfare, I think we've talked about this before. Maybe it was a did you know, but there are actually certain criteria for a lawful naval blockade. Things around declaration of notification, effectiveness, impartiality. The effectiveness is important, but also you can't just be discriminatory on your blockading oil coming out of Venezuela. That makes it more of a quarantine, not actually a definitional naval blockade in itself. And I think that there is something too. There is the bravado with the words, which are clearly part of a pressure campaign. But I think there is also clearly procedural stuff they're applying to this, to the point of, there was some critique this morning about this boarding operation. It's probably happened by the time this gets out of the MV Bella. And I think I mentioned before, there was a question about, well, why haven't they just gotten the fast roping team on board and boarded it? And it's very clear that the US, despite some of their rhetoric, I think is being very careful about escalation. So there's a difference between, as I said, a compliant and a non-compliant boarding. Now, if this was a naval blockade, they would not be worrying about compliant versus non-compliant boarding operations. Anyway, any comments on naval blockades before we move on?
Well, I guess a couple of points. One that you made at the very beginning, which is a naval blockade, well, a legal blockade, because that's another important point, but is an act of war. And the second one is that blockade is one of those words that has a very specific legal meaning, which is what you are talking about there. But it also has a much wider kind of strategic and common usage meaning. And the conflation of those two things is perennially a problem in these kind of discussions. But I think it's quite clear the Americans are not conducting a legal blockade of Venezuela. And if they were to do so, that would be a pretty significant escalation, even beyond what they're doing at the moment.
Yes, although less significant than the land strikes they've already threatened.
True. Anyway, let's move on and talk about capability.
Capability. Lots happening in capability.
Absolutely. So as you kind of mentioned briefly at the beginning, almost immediately that we released the previous podcast, there was an announcement from Jim Chalmers, the Australian Treasurer, that the quite long-awaited decision from the Foreign Investment Review Board, which was looking at whether or not Hanwha could buy a larger stake in Austal, the Australian shipbuilder, that a decision had been made, and that there will be no objection to Hanwha increasing its stake in Austal from 9.9% to 19.9%. This would mean that Hanwha would still be a minority shareholder, but would be the single largest minority shareholder. And that would then give it certain rights. There were some restrictions around this, so it couldn't increase its shareholding above 19.9%. There were also some other restrictions around governance, data information, including things like sort of access, Hanwha's access to sensitive information that Austal were using, and criteria, because as the largest minority shareholder, Hanwha would have the right to nominate somebody to sit on the Austal board. There would then be restrictions in place around, or criteria around that nomination. Why does this all matter? Certainly from an Australian perspective, it matters because Austal is I guess, one of the two key kind of companies, shipbuilding companies, naval shipbuilding companies in Australia. They operate in Western Australia and are critical to the wider Australian strategic shipbuilding plans. They're the expectation, or the plans at the moment, are that they will be building the Mogami class, upgraded Mogami class frigates under C3000. So the first 3 of those will be built in Japan. The remaining 8 will be built in Western Australia by Austal. Austal will also build the landing craft medium and landing craft heavy for the Australian Army. So they're a key part of Australia's naval shipbuilding ecosystem. They're also quite an important part of the American naval shipbuilding ecosystem, and are trying to grow in that space. So they're quite an important player. Why does this matter, and why has it been such a focus of attention? Well, Austal has been had its ups and downs and had certain commercial troubles and other things. Hanwha obviously is well known as a very, very successful Korean shipbuilder, and there's been questions about whether or not sort of technology and knowledge transfer into Austal could be very positive. At the same time, Austal are currently planning to build the upgraded Mogami class, as I mentioned, which is a Japanese design. And the Japanese have signaled that they are, previously signaled that they did not want this to go ahead, and made that pretty clear in both public commentary and, I'm sure, behind closed doors. So it raises some real kind of questions over that, and kind of imports the tensions that exist in Northeast Asia into WA. What were your thoughts about this one? Did you think it would happen?
I didn't. I don't necessarily have any strong feelings about it, but I think when it came out, I think I put on Twitter that I was surprised that this decision would be made. I guess, there's a couple of elements of it. One, I think it's important to note that this hasn't actually happened yet. All that's happened is that the Treasurer has come out and said that he supports the decision of the Foreign Investment Review Board, and it would be approved by the government if Hanwha went down this path. And Hanwha have previously indicated that they wanted to go down this path. The reason I thought it probably wouldn't be approved is there was very clear messaging, was certainly reporting of very clear messaging from unnamed Japanese officials that this was not something that Japan was entirely happy about. And you've got to remember that, of course, Hanwha and Mitsubishi are competitors, in fact, were competitors in the C3000 decision. I think the second element is that it's very clear that the Austal board has not been entirely supportive of this, and certainly the CEO of Austal has given some interviews on this point. And I think that there is some concern that because of Austal's success in the US. And to be honest, they've built more big ships in the US than they have. In fact, they haven't built any big. No, they have built some cats. But anyway, they've built more big ships in the US than they have in Australia because of Austal's success in the US. That this was seen as a way of getting access to the US shipbuilding market, and it wasn't necessarily a focus to make Austal a bigger, better, greater company, which would be at odds with Australia's national security interests. And certainly the government stated aims on making Austal a strategic shipbuilder, and Austal, to do that, of course, needs to grow in its skill set and its capacity, because the kinds of ships we're talking about Austal building in Australia, Austal hasn't built in Australia or hasn't built anywhere. And certainly, although the agreement has not been, it hasn't been announced that Austal's going to build the upgraded Mogami in Australia, that's certainly the direction we're heading in. So, I think they are valid concerns. And I thought that they would be persuasive for the Foreign Investment Review Board. In terms of the reasons I'm not necessarily entirely against this, I'm kind of on the fence on this one, is I do think that there are one of the things that needs to happen in Australia is very quickly Henderson needs to be turned into a new shipyard. And for anyone who's ever toured Osborne and what BAE and the Australian government have done at Osborne, it's a very impressive shipyard. It's taken a lot of work and a lot of money. That needs to happen at Henderson, and it needs to happen very, very quickly to start building the landing craft mediums, the landing craft heavies, and then eventually the frigates, and putting aside the conversation around maintenance of submarines and all that sort of stuff. And so I think that Hanwha clearly has been very successful in this sort of stuff. And a Hanwha stake in Austal could help Austal with some of the ability to do that on a scale that my view is Austal hasn't done before. So I think there are some benefits as well. I would assume, this hasn't been stated, but I would assume that if Hanwha is to take such a big stake in Austal, that would also come with a position on the board, which would be quite influential in some of this decision making. But again, all of that said, I actually didn't think that the government would support this. I thought that the Japanese and Austal's concerns would be persuasive. And so I was surprised to see that that's not the case. I guess you can see some geopolitical considerations in it as well, in terms of Australia seeing a relationship with Hanwha that doesn't, Hanwha doesn't just build ships. So a defence industrial relationship with Hanwha as important to building our own Australian defence industry. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. I guess we kind of need to see where it goes next. Some of these restrictions, limits on Hanwha's access to sensitive information, limits on the storage of sensitive information, and stringent criteria on any Hanwha nominee to Austal's board. The last one might be easy. The top two are probably going to be harder to manage than it would seem on paper. So I guess we have to see where it goes. If Hanwha does, in fact, buy that stake, which hasn't actually happened yet, but it has, I guess, been approved by the government. I would have thought too, actually, and I'm not tracking this, I don't know if you are, there would also be a US review approval that would be needed given Austal USA.
Certainly there was when there was discussion about an outright purchase, but I don't know what the level that requires a review would be. So, yeah, maybe watch that space. We might have to come back to our listeners on this one.
In 2020. Do you have any strong views? What was were you surprised?
No, I was a little surprised. I thought the easy option was to say no. Now, whether that's the right option, I honestly don't know. And it's really hard. But I thought that the easy option, particularly after such direct signalling from the Japanese, was to say no. And so I was a little surprised. Anyway, in other Austal news, Austal earlier on this week, last week, was awarded the contract for the design and it says design and build, but I think it's primarily finalised design and build of the landing craft medium. So these are the smaller of the two Australian Army watercraft vessels that are to be built. About a year or maybe 2 years ago, it was announced that the design for the landing craft medium would be a bird-on design. And I know that Austal and bird-on have been working together previously, so this is now the I guess it's sort of the rubber stamping in some ways of something that I think everyone knew was going to happen anyway. But it's the first stated I guess, full contract under the new strategic shipbuilding agreement. So in that regard, it's quite significant. It says that construction is supposed to start in 2026, with the 18th and final vessel delivered in 2032. We'll see about some of those timelines. I think that there've been, as you were pointing out, a number of questions raised about the whether or not Henderson's going to be ready for this wave of shipbuilding that is supposed to be coming out, and I think that there remain significant questions there.
They do. I do think perhaps, and again, look, there's just, I think one of the reasons there's so many questions is just a lack of detail about milestones for Henderson or who's in charge of what. And I think I had a piece in Lowy's Interpreter earlier this year talking about that. These are meant to be the same size, though, as an Armidale-class patrol boat. So I guess technically Austal could probably build these at their current yards. But I have no idea what's happening in terms of amalgamation and all of that sort of stuff, and whether they can do that whilst building up the broader yard at Henderson. So there are definitely questions. On a positive note, though, I can't remember the details. I just read it somewhere, but I saw 5 Australian Army Transport Corps officers graduated from whatever they're calling the warfare training course now in the Navy, who are now technically qualified, I guess, in the simulator to drive vessels of a certain type. I'm so out of date when it comes to seaman officer training or warfare officers, whatever they're called now. But that shows Army is moving down the training pipeline. I remain sceptical, I've got to say, about who is going to crew, not the landing craft mediums, I think they'll be crewed by Army, but who is going to crew the landing craft heavies. I remain sceptical.
Yep, I share that. But no, that I guess is good news, because it certainly has been one of the things that cynics like myself have long had questions over, is the personnel element of Army's move into the maritime.
Yes, anyway, we've gone way over time, but we should probably touch on... do you want to touch on the US frigate? We did talk about the US frigate last episode. We probably should give an update.
Very, very briefly, it has been announced that Huntington Ingalls Industries have got they've been selected to produce the next frigate, which is known as the FFX, based on their Legend class national security cutter, which has been built for the US Coast Guard. They're still making statements about the fact that it's supposed to be delivered in 2028. By all accounts, and from what has been seen and the comments that have come out from US Navy, this is basically going to be a national security cutter painted grey. The main focus in terms of any changes is about putting a platform above the open boat deck for mission packages, particularly around containerized munitions and things like this. Now, quite how that works without appropriate sensor systems fits into the same question that's been around all of this containerized sort of munitions, etc. It also raises some real questions around, well, what does this do that a littoral combat ship, of which the Americans have plenty, can't do? And I think that it raises further big questions about, well, was spinning the Constellation class program at that point in time the right decision, given the very, very limited capability, certainly compared to a Constellation class of the vessels that they're planning. Now, is there value in having a low-end platform? Yes. Is there much value in having a platform that's that low-end if you're focused on the Indo-Pacific? I'm less sure.
Well, this goes to the question about the LCS, right? I mean, the point about those is they're so low end. What are they useful for? They're great for boarding operations, but not for anything in contested maritime environment. And you can make the same comment about the Australian offshore patrol vessels, different size of vessel, but similar point. I'm not tracking closely the capabilities of these vessels, and I'm hoping for the US to solve this. I would really like to see it work out. But I did find hilarious. There was a Fincantieri Marine Group tweet that, I mean, looks to have been a legitimate tweet. It's been removed now, but
it got deleted pretty quickly.
It got deleted pretty quickly. We're just going to read it out because it's pretty funny. So Fincantieri, who are building the designers anyway of the Constellation class frigate.
Yeah,
so the tweet's like so Constellation was 99.4% compliant with Buy American provisions out of the gate, so it was an American ship. They're saying all US supply chain and the result of a fair and competitive selection process. Best of luck, HII. If NAVSEA can show some restraint, you might deliver a cutter in 2028, i.e. not a frigate, and you might. Pretty funny tweet. Obviously, yeah, deleted pretty quickly. But I guess that's all I have to say.
Did make me chuckle, I must say. Particularly as there were a couple of spicy tweets about C3000 a little while ago, and so I think there's some various people getting back in the game.
I love it. I love it when companies do funny things. Sometimes we're too sanitized. We probably should wrap it up there, but I did want to touch on. There was a comment on our YouTube, and I said at the start that we would touch on it. Look, to be honest, we didn't look too much at the capability discussions coming out of the Sea Power conference. Partially, I honestly didn't get a chance to look at any of the capability things at the Sea Power conference. But look, there was a comment talking about what did we think about the interview given by Rear Admiral Hughes, who's the head of Naval Capability in the Royal Australian Navy, with Naval News. A short interview available on YouTube. I'm sure we can share a link. And it was kind of following up on the discussion around node change. So I think one of the things we talked about extensively this year and probably last season as well was this idea that C3000 Australia, this future frigate, would have no change. I mean, of course, it is going to have changes. The hope is it doesn't have change to the same scale as the Constellation class frigate in the US or the Arafura OPV in Australia. But what came out of that interview that was significant? Look, certainly that the upgraded Mogami will operate the ESSM Block 2. That had kind of been hinted at through a few different conversations, but confirmation, which is good. Japan does not operate ESSM, and certainly Australia doesn't want to be introducing new missiles into its inventory, so that's positive. Also said in that interview was that Japan is looking to integrate naval strike missile for their own capabilities. So Australia and Japan will be operating naval strike missile on the upgraded Mogami, which again is a good positive. Not said in that interview, but said by Australia's Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy at the Sea Power conference that Australia's upgraded Mogami were operating SM2 and SM6, I think he said. I'll double check that, but I'm pretty sure. So that's all good news. And the other thing that came out of it was that the upgraded Mogami will have the CRAM capability on it, which will be a new capability for Australia. So that is a short-range air defence capability. One of the things I'd love to see is put on LHDs, to be honest. But that's a future hope. Not mentioned, but mentioned in a Naval News article that also came out of the Mogami discussions at Sea Power, that the Australian Mogami will have a triple torpedo launcher, which will be designed to operate the American Mark 54 torpedo, which this Naval News article highlights is a bit of an issue because the other RAN vessels operate the MU-90. I haven't looked into this, to be honest, so I don't really have a comment on it. Maybe I'll look into it for the 2026 episode. But look, thanks for flagging that interview for the person who flagged it on YouTube. And I think, yeah, some interesting knowledge there about the upgraded Mogami for Australia. Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I think it highlights once again the question of no change. As I understand it, and I'd have to go back and double check, but we're talking about different missiles to certainly the current Japanese Mogami.
Yes.
So and then questions around integration of combat systems. And there were a number of comments that were made at the time about combat systems, none of which quite seem to add up. And so I haven't seen any clarity on that. But I think there remain big questions around what is no change, and the changes that are made, as is often the case, relatively small changes can have quite big impacts once you start getting beyond something that is a straight military off-the-shelf capability. You can begin to have some quite significant cost and time overruns. So it's a wait and see would be my take on this. But I think it is good that we're not just literally taking it off the shelf, because I think there could be a whole host of other challenges there.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, even we focus a lot on weapon systems, but one of the biggest challenges is actually like, how do you accommodate your sailors? So the Royal Australian Navy has very different expectations to most navies around the world in terms of space in bunks, size of bunks, mess decks, and this actually has become historically one of the more controversial design issues in our ships, because other navies don't do it the same way, and we've had to learn that lesson through the Hobarts, through the Anzacs, etc. So look, we'll see, but certainly I think as much as there is a skeptical eye, I touch wood, am pretty confident that this will come out okay. There will be problems, but I think that the difference in this acquisition as opposed to some of the others is how invested Japan is to making this work, not just from a commercial standpoint, from a strategic standpoint. So I think that will help. Glass half full.
And on that positive note, I think we're going to say Merry Christmas to all of our listeners. We will be back in the new year, carrying on with Maritime Matters. So have a great holiday period. And as ever, keep watching the news and keep remembering that Maritime matters.
Maritime does matters. Thanks, Richard. Bye.